The British man looked me straight in the eye, glanced down at the tarnished brass key in my hand, and said words that made my knees feel weak. "Miss Carter, we've been looking for that key for 47 years. For a moment, neither of us moved. The Wyoming wind rattled the porch swing behind me. A pickup truck rolled down the county road. Everything looked perfectly normal, yet somehow my entire life had just tilted sideways. I remember staring at him and thinking he had the wrong house, the wrong woman, the wrong key, because 2 weeks earlier everyone in my family had laughed when I inherited it, including my own father. To understand how I ended up standing on my porch at 62 years old with a stranger from England asking about a key that supposedly mattered to Buckingham Palace, I need to go back to the day my grandfather died. My name is Evelyn Carter. I was born and raised outside Sheridan, Wyoming. If you've lived in ranch country, you know how families like ours work. Land isn't just property. It's identity. It's history. It's pride. And sometimes it's trouble. My grandfather, Walter Carter, was the kind of man people respected. A Korean War veteran. A rancher. A man who shook your hand firmly and looked you in the eye. He wasn't rich by New York standards, but around our county he had done very well. He owned thousands of acres of land. He had cattle, investments, and a small agricultural supply company that had grown steadily over the years. People assumed Grandpa would leave behind a fortune. They were right. When he passed away at 89, the entire family showed up. Not just for grief. If we're being honest, many of them showed up for the will. I hate saying that, but age teaches you to stop pretending. The funeral was held on a bright autumn morning. The church was full. Veterans sat in the front rows. Neighbors filled the pews. People told stories about Grandpa helping them during droughts, lending equipment when crops failed, and quietly paying bills for families who were struggling. That was Walter Carter. He never bragged. Most of the good things he did were discovered after he was gone. I sat quietly through the service. My father, Richard Carter, sat beside my brother, Stephen. Neither spoke much to me. That wasn't unusual. We weren't exactly close. For most of my life, I had been the overlooked child. Stephen was the golden boy, the future businessman, the son who could do no wrong. I was simply Evelyn, the daughter who stayed nearby, the daughter who helped, the daughter who was expected to understand. 3 days after the funeral, we gathered at the attorney's office. The atmosphere felt strange, too polite, too tense. Everyone waiting for their turn. Everyone pretending they weren't calculating numbers in their heads. The attorney, Harold Benson, had known Grandpa for decades. His face was serious as he opened the file. Walter wanted his wishes followed exactly as written. My father nodded. Stephen crossed his arms confidently. I sat quietly. Then the reading began. The ranch went to my father. All 3,000 acres, every pasture, every building, every piece of equipment. Dad looked satisfied. Not emotional, satisfied. Next came the agricultural company. That went entirely to Stephen. My brother tried to hide his smile. He failed. The company had been earning excellent money for years. Everyone knew it. Various relatives received cash inheritances, savings accounts, certificates, investments. By the time the attorney reached my name, I honestly wasn't expecting much. Maybe some money, maybe a small account, maybe Grandpa's old truck. Instead, Harold paused. He opened a separate envelope. Then he looked directly at me. "Evelyn," his voice softened. "Your grandfather left you this." He handed me a small wooden box. That's all. Just a box. The room became very quiet. I opened it. Inside was an old brass key. Nothing else. No diamonds. No stock certificates. No deeds, just a key. Underneath it sat a folded, handwritten note. I opened the note. The handwriting was unmistakably Grandpa's. It said, "One day someone will come asking for this. Listen before you judge. Love." "Grandpa!" I read it twice, then a third time. I had absolutely no idea what it meant. The silence lasted only a few seconds. Then Stephen laughed. Actually laughed. That's it. A few relatives chuckled. My father shook his head. Well, Walter always did enjoy mysteries. More laughter. Stephen leaned back in his chair. Looks like Grandpa left the treasure hunt to Evelyn. The room erupted again. I forced a smile. What else could I do? But the truth was their laughter hurt. Not because of the money. At 62, I wasn't chasing fortunes. I owned my home. I paid my bills. I lived comfortably. What hurt was the message everyone immediately assumed. That I wasn't important enough to inherit anything meaningful. That after years of helping Grandpa, this was somehow all I deserved. Then Dad delivered the line I would never forget. He pointed toward the box. "Looks like you got the junk." More laughter. Oh, I didn't argue. I simply closed the box, thanked the attorney, and went home. The drive took nearly 40 minutes. The Wyoming plains stretched endlessly around me. Golden grass, blue sky, the Bighorn Mountains in the distance. Normally that view calmed me. Not that day. That day I kept hearing their voices, their laughter, their assumptions. I thought about all the afternoons I'd spent helping Grandpa after Grandma died. Doctor appointments, groceries, hospital visits, hours sitting on his porch drinking coffee, listening to stories. None of that had been done for money. But suddenly I felt foolish. Maybe they were right. Maybe Grandpa had simply given me a sentimental keepsake. Maybe there was no deeper meaning. Over the next 2 weeks, life settled down. Dad focused on the ranch. Stephen celebrated his new ownership of the company. Family members talked endlessly about inheritances. The key sat on my kitchen table. Sometimes I'd pick it up, study it, turn it over. It looked old, heavy. The brass was worn smooth in places. No markings, no clues, just a key. And a strange note. One day someone will come asking for this. Listen before you judge. The words stayed with me. Then came the knock. A Thursday afternoon, about 3 o'clock. I opened my front door. A black luxury sedan sat in my driveway. A gray-haired gentleman stood on my porch wearing a dark suit. Polite. Professional. British. Miss Evelyn Carter. Yes. He offered a business card. I am Malcolm Reed. I glanced at the card, then back at him. I believe he said carefully, "You may possess an item that has been missing since 1979. My stomach tightened. He looked past me toward the house, then back into my eyes. Specifically, he said an old brass key. The world suddenly felt very quiet. I slowly reached into my pocket, pulled out the key. His expression changed instantly. Relief, disbelief, almost gratitude. Then he whispered the sentence that would change everything. "Miss Carter, we've been looking for that key for 47 years. I stood frozen on my front porch. The brass key suddenly felt heavier in my hand. The British gentleman, Malcolm Reed, was staring at it as if he'd just found a missing piece of history. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I managed to ask the obvious question. "What exactly are you talking about?" His expression softened. "May I come inside, Miss Carter?" Every warning bell in my head started ringing. At 62 years old, I'd learned not to trust strangers, especially strangers arriving in expensive foreign cars talking about lost keys. "I think you'd better explain first." He nodded respectfully. "Fair enough." Then he reached into a leather briefcase. What he pulled out next changed everything. The first item was a photograph, an old black and white photograph. The edges were yellowed with age. 2 young men stood side by side in military uniforms. One of them was my grandfather. I recognized him instantly despite the decades. The broad shoulders, the strong jaw, the calm eyes. The other man was someone I'd never seen before. Young, British, elegant even in military clothing. "Who is that?" I asked. Malcolm looked down at the photo. His name was Edward Harrington. The name meant nothing to me, at least not yet. 10 minutes later, we were sitting at my kitchen table. Coffee sat untouched between us. The key rested in the center. Malcolm carefully organized a stack of documents. The more papers he revealed, the less I believed this was some kind of scam. Military records, photographs, letters, government seals, historical archives. Everything looked authentic. "Miss Carter," Malcolm began, "your grandfather was not merely a rancher." I laughed softly. "I know that. He was a veteran." Malcolm nodded. "Yes. But what most people don't know is that during the Korean War, he became involved in an incident that remained confidential for decades." I leaned back in my chair. This was becoming stranger by the minute. "What kind of incident?" He opened another folder. Inside was a military report. Several sections had clearly been declassified years earlier. One name appeared repeatedly. Walter Carter. My grandfather. Malcolm began telling a story I had never heard before. In 1952, Grandpa's unit had been assigned to support a multinational operation near the Korean border. Among the personnel present was a young British diplomatic courier named Edward Harrington. Officially, Harrington wasn't supposed to be anywhere near active combat zones. Unofficially, he was carrying highly sensitive diplomatic materials. One evening, their convoy came under attack. Several vehicles were destroyed. Communications were cut. Chaos erupted. According to witness accounts, Harrington became trapped in a damaged transport truck. Enemy fire pinned everyone down. Several soldiers attempted a rescue. None could reach him. Then Walter Carter volunteered. My grandfather. The quiet rancher I knew. The man who spent mornings feeding cattle and afternoons drinking coffee on his porch. That man. Malcolm slid another document toward me. I stared at the report. The details made my heart race. Walter Carter had crossed nearly 80 yards of open ground under fire. Alone. He reached the truck, freed Harrington, carried him to safety, then returned to help evacuate 2 wounded soldiers. The operation saved multiple lives, including Harrington's. I read the report twice, then a third time. Grandpa never told me any of this. Malcolm smiled. According to everyone who knew him, he rarely spoke about the war. That was true. Whenever people asked questions, Grandpa usually changed the subject. I had always assumed painful memories were the reason. Now I wondered what else he had been keeping to himself. Or, after the war, Malcolm continued, Mr. Harrington returned to Britain. What happened to him? He entered government service. Malcolm paused. Eventually he became a trusted advisor to several members of the royal household. I blinked. The royal household. Yes. I suddenly understood why Buckingham Palace had become involved. At least partly. But I still didn't understand the key. Malcolm opened another folder. This one contained letters. Dozens of letters. Many handwritten. Some signed by Harrington. Others by my grandfather. The correspondence stretched across decades. The 2 men had remained friends. Close friends. I felt a lump forming in my throat. Grandpa had written letters to this man for nearly 40 years. Yet I had never heard his name. The realization felt strangely sad. Even after all those years together, parts of Grandpa's life had remained completely hidden. Then Malcolm finally addressed the key. In 1979, he said Mr. Harrington found himself responsible for safeguarding certain materials. What kind of materials? Historical documents. Important documents, extremely important. His tone made me sit straighter. Important enough that they needed to disappear temporarily. I frowned. Disappear. Malcolm nodded. There were concerns regarding theft and unauthorized access. Nothing criminal, nothing scandalous. Simply sensitive historical records whose protection was considered essential. He pointed toward the brass key. Mr. Harrington entrusted access to those materials to exactly one person. I already knew the answer. My grandfather. Yes. The room felt impossibly quiet. Outside, a meadowlark landed near the fence. A tractor hummed somewhere in the distance. Ordinary Wyoming sounds. Meanwhile, my grandfather's life was becoming less ordinary by the minute. Why him? Malcolm smiled. Because your grandfather had already proven he could be trusted with another man's life. That answer hit me harder than I expected. Not because it sounded dramatic. Because it sounded exactly like Grandpa. Dependable. Steady. Trustworthy. The qualities nobody celebrates until they desperately need them. The arrangement was simple, Malcolm continued. A secure deposit container was established. A safety deposit box, similar though considerably more secure. And Grandpa got the key. Yes, the only key. Malcolm hesitated, then nodded. The only key. I stared at the brass object resting on my table. Suddenly it no longer looked ordinary. 47 years. 47 years people had searched for it. Yet it had been sitting in my grandfather's house all along. What happened? Malcolm sighed. Mr. Harrington died unexpectedly in the early 1980s. Before retrieving the documents. Correct. Didn't anyone know where the key was? Number. I looked down. Because Grandpa never told anyone. Precisely. The search began. Records were examined. Properties investigated. Former associates interviewed. Nothing. The key had vanished. At least that's what everyone believed. I remembered the note. One day someone will come asking for this. Listen before you judge. A chill ran through me. Grandpa had known. Somehow he had known. Not when. Not who. But eventually someone would come. And now someone had. Why give it to me? I asked quietly. Why not Dad? Why not my brother? Malcolm didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened one final envelope. Inside was a short handwritten statement. Signed by Walter Carter, my grandfather. Malcolm slid it across the table. My hands trembled as I read. If this key is ever needed, give it to Evelyn. She listens. She keeps her word. And she understands that some things matter more than money. I couldn't speak. For a moment, all I could see was Grandpa sitting on his porch, coffee in one hand, sunset over the ranch, watching quietly while everyone else talked. Watching. Knowing. Planning. Trusting. Me. The tears came before I could stop them. Not because of the mystery. Not because of the key. Because after a lifetime of feeling overlooked, I finally understood something. Grandpa had seen me. The real me. All along. Malcolm allowed me a few moments to compose myself. Then he spoke carefully. There is one final thing you should know. I wiped my eyes. What is it? The container still exists. I stared at him. The documents are still there. Yes. And the key opens it. Yes. My pulse quickened. What's inside? For the first time since arriving, Malcolm looked genuinely excited. Miss Carter, he said quietly, the contents are believed to be worth several $1,000,000. And just like that, the inheritance everyone had laughed at became the most valuable thing my grandfather had ever left behind. The funny thing about money is that it can change people's attitudes faster than almost anything else. For 2 weeks, I had been the woman who inherited junk. The forgotten daughter. The disappointment. The one who got a brass key while everyone else received land businesses and bank accounts. Then Malcolm Reed told me the contents connected to that key might be worth millions. Within 48 hours, everything changed. And not for the better. The first person to call was my brother, Stephen. That alone told me something was wrong. My brother rarely called unless he needed something. The phone rang while I was drinking coffee on my back porch. I almost didn't answer. Almost. Hello, Evelyn. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. That should have been my first warning. How are you doing? I nearly laughed. In 62 years, I couldn't remember Stephen ever opening a conversation by asking how I was doing. I'm fine. Good. An awkward pause followed. Then he finally arrived at the real reason for the call. I heard you had a visitor from England. There it was. The reason. Not concern. Not family. Curiosity. Or more accurately, greed. News travels quickly in Wyoming, especially in small towns. Apparently someone had seen Malcolm's black sedan parked outside my house. Someone mentioned it at a diner. Someone else mentioned Buckingham Palace. Within a day, half the county was talking. Within 2 days, my family knew. Who told you? I asked. Oh, people talk. Of course they did. Stephen lowered his voice. So what's the story? Nothing finalized. Come on, Evelyn. I remained silent. He tried a different approach. We're family. The words irritated me more than they should have. Because whenever people suddenly start saying, we're family, it usually means they want something. The conversation lasted another 10 minutes. By the end of it, Stephen had asked at least 12 questions. How valuable were the documents? Would there be a reward? Did the British government offer compensation? Would ownership transfer? Could family members be included? I answered almost none of them. After we hung up, I sat quietly on the porch. The mountains looked beautiful in the morning sunlight. Yet something felt wrong. For years, Stephen barely showed interest in my life. Now he couldn't stop calling. Dad arrived 3 days later, unannounced. I saw his truck pull into the driveway shortly after lunch. He stepped out carrying the same confident expression he'd worn most of his life, the expression of a man accustomed to being in charge. I invited him inside. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Malcolm had explained everything. Dad got straight to the point. Stephen says there's money involved. No greeting, no small talk, just money. I folded my hands. We don't know that yet, but there might be. Possibly. He nodded thoughtfully, then leaned forward. Well, whatever happens, we should handle it together. I almost smiled, not because the suggestion was unreasonable, because it arrived about 2 weeks too late. Together, I asked. Of course. Like when everyone laughed at Grandpa's gift. Dad looked uncomfortable. Nobody meant anything by that. I remembered every word, every laugh, every smirk, especially his. Looks like you got the junk. Funny how quickly junk becomes important when someone thinks it might be valuable. Dad shifted in his chair. Let's not dwell on that. But I wanted to dwell on it. Not out of anger. Out of honesty. Older people learn something important. Pretending something never happened doesn't heal anything. Why not? I asked. You laughed too. His eyes dropped briefly. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Long enough for both of us to know I was right. For the next hour, Dad talked about family unity. Family responsibility. Family interests. The word family appeared so often it almost lost meaning. Yet one thing was noticeably absent. An apology. Not once did he say he was sorry. Not once did he admit they had treated me poorly. Instead, he spoke as though the situation naturally belonged to everyone. As though Grandpa's explicit decision somehow didn't matter anymore. When he finally left, I felt exhausted. Not angry. Just tired. Ooh. The following week brought more surprises. Cousins started calling. Aunts I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly wanted lunch. People became interested in my schedule, interested in my plans, interested in my relationship with Malcolm. I felt like a woman who had accidentally won the lottery. Everyone suddenly remembered my phone number. Meanwhile, Malcolm continued his investigation. Several lengthy phone calls followed. Documents moved between historians, attorneys, and archivists. Eventually, he called with major news. The container has been located. I nearly dropped the phone. What? The vault. My heart started racing. You found it? Yes. Where? A private banking facility in London. I sat down immediately. After all these years, after decades, the container still existed. Waiting. Locked. Untouched. Oh. A week later, Malcolm returned to Wyoming, this time carrying additional documentation. Everything was arranged. Travel plans, security procedures, legal paperwork, historical verification. The amount of preparation astonished me. Clearly, this wasn't some forgotten storage box. This mattered. A great deal. Then came the discovery that shocked me most. The key wasn't merely symbolic. It genuinely worked. Without it, the container could not legally be accessed through the original agreement. My grandfather had protected access for nearly half a century, simply by keeping a promise nobody else even knew existed. The closer we moved toward opening the container, the more pressure arrived from my family. Stephen called almost daily. Dad began stopping by regularly. Their questions became increasingly specific. How much do you think it's worth? Have they offered compensation? Will ownership be shared? What percentage belongs to the family? One evening, Stephen finally said what he'd been thinking all along. You know, Grandpa would have wanted us all to benefit. I almost laughed, because we both knew that wasn't true. Grandpa had already made his decision. Clearly, deliberately, legally, and Stephen hated it. A few days later, Malcolm and I participated in a conference call with historians in London. That's when everything changed again. The experts had completed preliminary research. The contents weren't merely valuable. They were historically significant. Potentially very significant. Documents connected to post-war diplomacy. Personal correspondence. Military records. Private journals. Materials believed lost for decades. I sat silently while they discussed preservation, authentication, and historical importance. The money suddenly felt secondary. What mattered was the story, the history, the truth. Mind. Then one historian made a comment I'll never forget. Your grandfather may have preserved one of the most important privately held collections we've encountered in years. I stared out my window. The Wyoming sunset was turning the sky orange. Grandpa would have hated all this attention. He wasn't that kind of man. Yet somehow the truth was finally catching up with him. 3 days later, another phone call arrived. This one from Malcolm. His voice sounded different. Excited. Miss Carter? Yes. We've completed a preliminary review of several inventory records. And you should know something before the story becomes public. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. What story? The story of Walter Carter. I sat forward. What about it? There was a brief pause. Then Malcolm said the words that would soon turn my grandfather into national news. A major American newspaper wants exclusive rights to publish the account of his wartime actions. I felt my breath catch, because for the first time I realized this was no longer about money. It was about legacy. And once the truth came out, everyone, including my father and brother, would finally learn who Walter Carter had really been. The first newspaper article appeared on a Sunday morning. I was sitting at my kitchen table wearing an old flannel robe and drinking coffee when my phone started vibrating. By the third call, I knew something unusual had happened. By the 10th, I knew my life had changed again. The article wasn't about the mysterious key. It wasn't about Buckingham Palace. And it wasn't about hidden documents worth millions. It was about Walter Carter, my grandfather, the man almost everyone thought they knew, the man almost nobody truly understood. The reporter had spent weeks verifying military records, interviewing historians, and examining the newly recovered correspondence. The story painted a picture of a man far different from the quiet rancher most people remembered. For decades, Grandpa had carried extraordinary experiences without talking about them. The article detailed his actions during the Korean War, his rescue of Edward Harrington, the risks he took, the lives he saved, the trust he earned, the promises he kept, and perhaps most importantly, the fact that he had never used any of it to seek recognition. That part touched people. especially older Americans. People who came from generations that believed service spoke louder than self-promotion. By noon, the article had spread far beyond Wyoming. Veterans organizations began sharing it. Military history groups picked it up. Local television stations called. Radio hosts wanted interviews. Historians requested access to additional records. I watched it happen from my little kitchen in disbelief. For nearly 30 years after Grandma died, Grandpa had spent most mornings feeding cattle and fixing fences. Now people across the country were learning his name. Part of me wished he were alive to see it. Another part knew he would have hated every second of the attention. The first interview request arrived that afternoon. I almost declined. Public speaking had never been my favorite thing. But Malcolm encouraged me. Your grandfather's story deserves to be told. So I agreed. The interview took place over the phone. The reporter asked thoughtful questions. Not sensational questions, human questions. What kind of man was Walter Carter? I smiled. Dependable. The answer surprised her. That's the first word that comes to mind. Absolutely. Because heroism sounds exciting. Dependability sounds ordinary. Yet when life becomes difficult, dependable people are the ones who save you. Grandpa understood that. Over the following weeks, interest continued growing. Newspapers published follow-up stories. Military historians uncovered additional records. Former service members contacted reporters with memories passed down through their families. Every new detail added another piece to the puzzle. The quiet old rancher from Wyoming gradually became something larger, a symbol of a generation that served without demanding applause. And then something unexpected happened. People started asking questions about my father. Not cruel questions. Natural ones. Questions that came from comparing his life to Grandpa's. Questions Dad clearly wasn't prepared to answer. For decades, he had been known as Walter Carter's son, the heir to the ranch, the public face of the family business. Now reporters wanted to know more about Walter himself. And suddenly Dad wasn't standing in the spotlight anymore. He was standing beside it. I didn't enjoy watching him struggle. Despite everything that had happened, he was still my father. But I couldn't ignore what I was seeing. For years, he'd enjoyed the respect associated with Grandpa's reputation. Now people wanted to know who had actually built that reputation. The answer wasn't Richard Carter. It was Walter. The truth wasn't humiliating him. The truth was simply removing the illusion. Stephen struggled even more. The agricultural company he'd inherited wasn't doing as well as everyone assumed. That fact gradually became obvious. Several poor business decisions had begun catching up with him. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to create problems. Employees started comparing his leadership to Grandpa's. Customers did the same. Investors noticed. And comparisons rarely favored Stephen. One evening he called me. For once he didn't sound confident. He sounded tired. You enjoying this? The question caught me off guard. Enjoying what? All of it. I knew exactly what he meant. The attention, the interviews, the recognition, the sudden shift in family dynamics. Number. There was silence. Then he laughed bitterly. Come on, Evelyn. I'm serious. People treat you differently now. I stared out my kitchen window. The sun was setting behind the mountains. That's not my fault. Number. His voice softened. I guess it isn't. After we hung up, I thought about revenge. Not dramatic movie revenge. Real revenge. The kind people secretly dream about after years of being overlooked. Years of disrespect. Years of feeling invisible. I realized something surprising. I wasn't getting revenge. Not really. Because I wasn't doing anything. I wasn't exposing secrets. I wasn't humiliating anyone. I wasn't attacking my father or brother. I was simply telling the truth whenever someone asked. And somehow the truth was proving far more powerful than anger. One afternoon, a television producer asked me a question during an interview. What do you think your grandfather would want people to remember? I answered without hesitation. That character matters more than recognition. The producer nodded. Can you explain? Most people spend their lives trying to be noticed. I smiled. My grandfather spent his life trying to do the right thing whether anyone noticed or not. The clip aired nationally. People responded strongly. Letters arrived. Emails. Messages from veterans. Messages from families. Messages from people who saw pieces of their own parents and grandparents in Walter Carter. The greatest irony was that Grandpa finally received recognition precisely because he never chased it. That lesson stayed with me, especially during difficult conversations with family. Then came another major development. An invitation. Official. Formal. Unexpected. Malcolm personally delivered it. We sat in my living room while he carefully removed a cream-colored envelope from his briefcase. The paper looked expensive. The seal looked important. My stomach immediately tightened. "What is that?" Malcolm smiled. "I believe you'll want to read it." I opened the envelope. Inside was a formal invitation to London. Representatives connected to the royal household wished to recognize Walter Carter's contribution to preserving historically significant materials and honoring commitments made decades earlier. I read it twice, then a third time. Surely I was misunderstanding something. Are they inviting me? Yes. To England? Yes. Why? Malcolm's smile widened. Because your grandfather's story has reached people who believe it deserves proper recognition. For several moments, I simply stared at the invitation. I had never traveled overseas. Not once. At 62 years old, my life had been spent mostly between Wyoming, Montana, and a handful of neighboring states. Now London was suddenly becoming real. The idea felt overwhelming. Exciting. Terrifying. Then Malcolm said something that made my pulse quicken. "This is only the beginning." "What does that mean?" He leaned back comfortably. "The recovered collection contains more than historical documents." I frowned. "What else is there?" "A great many things we're still cataloging." And Malcolm's expression became thoughtful. "We recently discovered evidence suggesting your grandfather left behind one final message." A chill ran through me. One final message. Yes? A letter. I swallowed hard. "A letter for who?" Malcolm looked directly at me. "For you." And for the first time since this extraordinary journey began, I realized Grandpa's greatest secret might still be waiting for me on the other side of the Atlantic. At 62 years old, I took my first trip across the Atlantic. If you'd told me 6 months earlier that I'd be flying to London because of a secret my grandfather had carried for nearly half a century, I would have laughed. Not because it sounded impossible, because my life had always been ordinary. And I had learned long ago that ordinary people rarely find themselves at the center of extraordinary stories. Yet there I was, sitting by an airplane window, watching Wyoming disappear beneath the clouds, holding Grandpa's brass key in my purse. The same key my family had mocked. The same key that had somehow unlocked a door into a life I never knew he had lived. The flight was long enough to think, long enough to remember. I spent hours staring out the window, replaying memories of Grandpa. The small things, the important things, the things nobody writes newspaper articles about. The way he always carried peppermints in his shirt pocket. The way he tipped his hat to strangers. The way he listened more than he talked. For weeks the world had been celebrating his heroism. But those weren't the moments I missed. I missed the quiet moments, the human moments, the grandfather moments. Oh, when the plane landed, London felt like another world. The buildings, the accents, the history. Even the air felt different. Malcolm met me at the airport. "Welcome to England, Miss Carter." I smiled. "Please call me Evelyn. Only if you call me Malcolm." Deal. For the first time since we'd met, neither of us was talking about documents, historians, or legal agreements. We were simply two older people sharing a remarkable journey. The next several days passed in a blur. Meetings, archives, historical reviews, tours of facilities connected to the recovered collection. Everywhere we went, people treated Grandpa's story with enormous respect. That mattered to me. Because the more I learned, the more I realized this was never about money. It was about trust. A promise made. A promise kept. Across generations. Across oceans. Across nearly 50 years. So, one afternoon, Malcolm escorted me to a private archive facility. Several historians were waiting. The recovered materials had been carefully cataloged and preserved. I stood before display tables covered with documents. Letters, journals, military records, photographs. Some hadn't been seen in decades. One historian handed me a pair of white gloves. "Take your time." I nodded, then carefully lifted the first journal. My grandfather's handwriting stared back at me. For a moment I couldn't breathe. It felt as though he had suddenly stepped back into the room. I spent hours reading. Page after page. Memory after memory. Stories he'd never shared. Experiences he'd never discussed. Thoughts he'd kept private. Some entries described wartime events. Others described life back in Wyoming. Many mentioned family, including me. That surprised me most. I found references to birthdays, conversations, visits, simple moments I barely remembered. Yet Grandpa had recorded them, preserved them, valued them, far more than I ever realized. The next morning brought the ceremony. The event wasn't enormous. It wasn't designed for television. It wasn't some grand spectacle. Instead, it felt dignified, respectful, personal. Exactly the kind of recognition Grandpa would have preferred. Representatives from several institutions attended. Military historians, archivists, officials connected to the royal household. A handful of invited guests. Nothing flashy. Nothing excessive. Just gratitude. When they spoke about Walter Carter, they didn't focus on money, or fame, or headlines. They focused on character, integrity, trust. The qualities that had allowed one promise to survive for 47 years. As I listened, I felt proud. Not because Grandpa was being honored, because the values he lived by were being honored. In a world that often celebrates wealth and status, people were celebrating decency. That felt important. Near the end of the ceremony, a presentation took place. A commemorative medal, posthumously awarded, presented in recognition of service courage and stewardship. When they handed it to me, emotion nearly overwhelmed me. I wished Grandpa could have accepted it himself. He deserved that moment. Not me. Him. Always him. Later that afternoon, Malcolm approached me carrying a small archival box. His expression immediately caught my attention. What is it? I believe we've found the item I mentioned. My pulse quickened. The letter. He nodded. The letter. For a moment I couldn't move. Everything else suddenly faded away. The ceremony. The recognition. The historical discoveries. All of it. Only one thing mattered. A final message from Grandpa. We found a quiet room. No reporters. No historians. Just Malcolm and me. He placed the letter gently in front of me. The envelope was yellowed with age. My name appeared on the front, written in Grandpa's familiar handwriting. Evelyn. Nothing more. Just Evelyn. Tears immediately filled my eyes. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet. I unfolded it carefully. Then I began to read. The room disappeared. The years disappeared. For a little while it was just me and Grandpa. One final conversation. The letter wasn't long, but every word mattered. He explained why he'd chosen me. Not because I was smarter. Not because I was more successful. Not because I was family. He chose me because I listened. Because I cared for people. Because I understood things that couldn't be measured in dollars. Then I reached the sentence that broke me. The sentence I still remember word for word. The key was never the treasure. The treasure was knowing who you are when nobody believes in you. I stopped reading. The tears came instantly. Harder than they had at his funeral. Harder than they had during the inheritance. Harder than they had during the ceremony. Because suddenly everything made sense. The ranch wasn't the point. The company wasn't the point. The documents weren't the point. Even the key wasn't the point. The lesson was the point. Grandpa had spent years watching people measure worth through ownership. Land. Money. Titles. Success. Meanwhile, he had been measuring something entirely different. Character. Patience. Loyalty. Integrity. For most of my life, I'd quietly wondered whether being overlooked meant being less valuable. The letter answered that question forever. Number. Absolutely not. The people who shout the loudest aren't always the strongest. The people who receive the most attention aren't always the most important. Sometimes the people changing lives are the ones nobody notices. Grandpa had noticed. That was enough. That evening I sat alone in my hotel room overlooking the city lights of London. The letter rested beside me. The medal sat nearby. For the first time in weeks I felt peace. Real peace. Not excitement. Not vindication. Peace. Then my phone rang. The number was from Wyoming. I answered immediately. And what I heard next made my heart sink. My father had suffered a serious health scare. And suddenly everything that had happened between us felt far less important. The flight home felt completely different from the flight to London. When I had left Wyoming, my mind had been full of questions. Now it was full of answers. The letter from Grandpa rested safely inside my carry-on bag. I must have read it 20 times during the trip. Maybe more. Every time I read it, another piece of my life seemed to fall into place. The key was never the treasure. The treasure was knowing who you are when nobody believes in you. Those words stayed with me all the way across the Atlantic. But as comforting as they were, they couldn't stop me from worrying about my father. The moment I landed in Wyoming, I drove straight from the airport to the hospital. The familiar roads seemed different somehow. Maybe because I had changed. Maybe because life had changed. Or maybe because age teaches you that some things matter less than you thought they did. For weeks, I had watched my father and brother reveal sides of themselves I didn't like. I had every reason to feel resentful. Yet as I parked outside the hospital, none of that seemed important. When someone you love is sick, old arguments suddenly lose their power. Dad looked smaller than I remembered. That was the first thing I noticed. For most of my life, Richard Carter had seemed larger than life. Strong, confident, certain. The kind of man who walked into every room expecting to be heard. Now he looked tired, fragile, older. For the first time, I wasn't looking at my father. I was looking at an 84-year-old man. There is a difference. His eyes opened when I entered. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he gave a weak smile. "You made it home." Of course I did. I pulled a chair beside his bed. The machines hummed softly around us. Neither of us seemed to know where to begin. Finally, Dad looked toward the window. I saw the ceremony. I nodded. A friend recorded it. Another silence followed. Then he surprised me. I was proud of him. "Grandpa!" "Yes." His voice cracked slightly. I always was. For the next hour, we talked more honestly than we had in decades. Not because one of us suddenly became wiser. Because age had finally removed our excuses. There wasn't enough time left for pretending. Dad stared at the blanket covering his legs. "You want to know something ugly?" I didn't answer. I simply listened. Just like Grandpa had taught me. I was jealous. The word seemed painful for him to say. "Of who?" "You." I blinked. "Me." He nodded. "Your relationship with my father." For several seconds, I genuinely didn't know how to respond. Dad swallowed hard. "You got the version of him I always wanted." The confession stunned me. For years, I had assumed he was the favorite. The chosen son. The heir. The one who received everything. Apparently, he had been carrying his own wounds all along. "He was proud of you," I said softly. "I know that now." His eyes filled with tears. "But when you're young, knowing isn't always enough." I understood that. Probably more than he realized. Sometimes people spend entire lives chasing approval they already have. Dad shook his head. I focused on the ranch. He looked toward me. Then I focused on money. Another pause. Then I focused on proving myself. His voice dropped lower. And somewhere along the way, I stopped focusing on people. The honesty hurt. Because it was true. Not just about him. About many people. Maybe all people. We get distracted. We confuse success with meaning. Achievement with fulfillment. Possession with happiness. Grandpa had understood the difference. Dad was only now learning it. A few days later, Stephen visited. The conversation was even more surprising. For once, there was no defensiveness. No excuses. No competition. No argument. Just honesty. He sat across from me in Dad's living room. The same room where we had celebrated birthdays and holidays for decades. The same room where countless family disagreements had unfolded. Yet this conversation felt different. "I owe you an apology." I studied him carefully. He looked exhausted. Older. Much older than the confident businessman who had laughed at the inheritance meeting. What for? His laugh was humorless. Where should I start? Neither of us smiled. "I treated you badly." He looked down. For years, the room remained silent. Then he added the words I never expected to hear. I was wrong. No explanation. No justification. No blame. Just accountability. Rare. Simple. Powerful. I could have punished him. Emotionally, I mean. I could have listed every hurt. Every insult. Every slight. Every year of feeling invisible. Part of me even wanted to. For about 3 seconds. Then I remembered Grandpa's letter. The treasure was knowing who you are when nobody believes in you. I knew who I wanted to be. And it wasn't a bitter old woman keeping score. "I forgive you." Stephen looked stunned. "Just like that." "Number." I smiled gently. "Not just like that. Years of pain don't disappear instantly. But forgiveness begins with a decision. And I was making one. The following months brought healing. Not perfection. Healing. There's a difference. Families don't magically become healthy overnight. But they can become healthier. Dad recovered slowly. Stephen began restructuring the company with more humility than before. Conversations became easier. Honesty became more common. For the first time in years, we actually felt like a family. Not because of money, not because of inheritance, because we had finally started telling the truth. As for me, I made a decision. Part of the compensation associated with the recovered historical collection came to me legally. Far more money than I ever expected. Far more than I needed. So I used it differently. I established a scholarship fund for veterans' families. I partnered with local historical organizations. I helped create educational programs preserving stories from older generations before those stories disappeared forever. Because that's what Grandpa had really protected. Not documents, stories, lessons, values, memory. A year later, we held a small ceremony near the ranch. Nothing elaborate. Just family, friends, veterans, neighbors, the kind of gathering Grandpa would have appreciated. At sunset, I stood beside a memorial plaque honoring Walter Carter. The Wyoming sky stretched endlessly above us. Golden light covered the hills. For a moment, everything felt exactly right. People often ask me whether I was angry when my father got the ranch and my brother got the company. The answer is yes. For a while people ask whether I felt vindicated when the truth came out. A little, if I'm honest. But those feelings didn't last. Because eventually I realized something. Grandpa didn't leave Dad the ranch because it was the most valuable thing. He didn't leave Stephen the company because it was the most important thing. And he didn't leave me the key because it was worth millions. He left each of us a lesson. Mine simply took longer to understand. Today the brass key sits inside a display case in my home. Visitors often ask about it. Sometimes I tell the full story. Sometimes I don't. But whenever I look at it, I remember Grandpa's final gift. Not the key. Not the documents. Not the recognition. The lesson. The truth. The understanding that character matters when nobody is watching. That kindness matters when nobody rewards it. That integrity matters when nobody notices. And that sometimes the inheritance that looks worthless becomes the one that changes your life. If this story reminded you of someone you've loved, someone you've lost, or someone you still need to forgive, I hope you'll take a moment to think about them today. And if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or forgotten, remember this. Your value is not determined by what people give you. It's determined by who you choose to become. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story touched your heart, feel free to share it with someone who may need the reminder. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, family forgiveness, and second chances, I'd be honored to have you join me again.